1 week ago, Lil Yachty was a worthless stain in the music industry. Nothing more than a vapid cash cow who I personally didn't care for at all. As I'm sure you're all aware, his newest record, Let's Start Here, was released very recently. And compared to all of his other records, there's something distinctly different about this one before you even start listening to it. Can you see what it is? My opinions towards this musician were always rather conflicting. I've always detested his lyrical content, which I always thought was a bit horrible and silly and not very charming at all, which is sort of what he was going for, I felt. Particularly in his worst record, Nothing to Prove. That being said, I did always appreciate the energy he came in with on many other people's songs, sort of the features he did, and even the occasional song by himself as well. He had some great songs with some cold flows and some sick beats, however, his delivery most of the time was just a bit flat and shallow, especially recently. As I'm sure we're all aware, however, this one is different, because people actually seem to like it. I think for a good Lil Yachty album you need legitimate songs where every aspect works harmoniously, an underlying aura of authenticity and personality, which is nowhere to be seen in many of his recent albums, where it's all just padded out with countless features, and also some good production, or at the very least, intriguing production. Because the chances of Yachty mesmerizing us lyrically is frankly very low, and it needs to be made up for Travis Scott style. None of these qualities have been seen from Yachty, in my opinion, for the last 4 years or so, with Lil Boat 3, Nothing to Prove, and Michigan Boy, and I don't think he's ever put something out with, you know, all of those aspects working together. So the question for me is, how will this new album, Let's Start Here, hold up? Well, somewhat fittingly, the first track is a great place to start. So the Black Seminole is not only the longest track on the record, but also one of the longest, if not the longest, Lil Yachty song, period. A 7-minute song from this artist was just unheard of, by this point at least. I never could have seen this coming, but it is very fitting for the album length, as well as the album title. It really does signify a new beginning, an attempt to reinvent himself as an artist. This is further aided and evidenced by a level and quality of production that, much like the length, have never been seen before by this artist. The scope and sound here is amazing and ambitious and interesting and dynamic. It's so different from everything else that the guy has put out. And that surprise factor only makes this song so much more impactful. Now, unfortunately, one thing that hasn't changed is Lil Yachty's lyrical shortcomings. Despite the perfect blend of trap and almost Pink Floydian instrumentation here at points, the lyrics are just as nonsensical as every song that precedes it. And I'm also not too crazy about the vocal delivery, which is just so drowned in walls of reverb, it's slightly too difficult to take seriously. The Ride focuses more on the psychedelic side of this album, once again transforming Yachty's infamous sound into something actually palatable, delivering a more Tame Impala sounding instrumental this time. As the dreamy yet exciting production soars through the track, I'm a much bigger fan of the delivery here, even if it's not quite as interesting musically. Whilst I am a fan of Running Out of Time's jazz intro, the bassy, bluesy, funky vibes, and it's definitely one of the groovier cuts on this thing, I don't think it packs as much of a punch as the previous two songs. It's as though Yachty knows we've already been hooked in, so now he's just chilling slightly, because it is undoubtedly quite a chill song, and it succeeds in that neo-soul sort of sound. I just think it could have done with some extra ideas or a shorter runtime, as I do think it drags a little despite the impressive production. Pretty is probably the first song on this thing that I would class as bad. I'm not really a fan of this one at all. The lyrics are at their worst, and the pacing is mind-numbingly nocturnal and slow, with some ridiculous vocals from Yachty himself, albeit a decent feature near the end. I'll give this track a miss most of the time. There isn't much to say about Failure because it is just an interlude, but I will say that it does do a good job continuing the vibe of the project, and whilst the spoken word passage is a lot weaker and more shallow than I'm sure he intended it to be, with some really pretentious like and laughs in the middle of it which just sounds so artificial. Once again, it is somewhat saved by the production and the brilliantly smooth transition into the zone, which is almost shoegazy in its atmosphere. And that can be really good, but once again, it doesn't really contribute much to the album other than just continuing the vibe. I think there's a lot of dead air. It has the same problem that I find a lot of shoegaze songs have, which is just, it's a little bit repetitive and gets old rather quickly. It's also pretty uninteresting progression-wise, and whilst the delivery here is smoother than a lot of the other cuts, it doesn't really do enough to warrant me returning to this song at all. The next track, We Saw the Sun, is spectacular, however. Once again, we're brought into it with a satisfying transition, and it takes so many successful risks, with the most enjoyable vocal delivery in the entire album, and a very fitting Bob Ross sample, because the song really does sound like you're injecting a Bob Ross painting into your veins. Bob Ross were a hip-hop artist, I feel like this is the type of song that he'd put out. This is probably the best song on the project, aside from the opener. Drive Me Crazy brings back the neo-soul aura of Running Out of Time. It's got a great intro, and I think it does a better job with the instrumentation than that second song, even if it is a little bit messy at points. I've Officially Lost My Vision is another huge highlight in this track list. A lot of these songs kind of speak for themselves, and it gets a little predictable after a while. Like, once the initial surprises of the first 2 tracks or so pass, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because said predictions tend to be extremely pleasant and dreamy passages of psychedelic rock and bluesy trap sounds. And a lot of the record is carried by the production as opposed to Lil Yachty himself. I've Officially Lost My Vision, however, for lack of a better term, is a reinvention and an out-of-left-field sound in an already reinventing and out-of-left-field project. Yachty really could just have played it safe and done what he was doing throughout the entire album here, and still have ended up with a really good album. But instead, he goes the extra mile and keeps our interest peaked at all times. I really appreciate this one, and my respect for the artist has gone up tenfold. Say Something is one of the only songs where I actually enjoy the lyrics. I mean, they're not amazing or anything, but they're innocent and charming and fundamentally real and genuine. Lil Yachty is never gonna be like a good lyricist or an amazing poet, so it's nice to see him not take himself as seriously here, as I think he has done in recent times. He just sort of accepts the fact that he's not a lyricist primarily. So on this project, you get an unfiltered and unapologetic version of the artist, who actually does a stellar job presenting himself. I think the walls of reverb actually work a lot better here than they do in the opening track, as well as the whole album just in general, really. Paint the Sky is one of the more straightforward and on-the-nose cuts here, but it works well as a nice change of pace, I suppose, as well as delivers another brilliant transition into the next song. In fact, the medley-like transitions complement the entire second half of this record to unspeakable levels. Should I Be as well as The Alchemist are both some of the less impressive songs on this album, but that's not really an insult for a project so consistently enjoyable as this one. I probably wouldn't go back to these songs as often because I don't think they work too well as standalone tracks, but they work together extremely well. Reach the Sunshine, however, is about as good as you could ever want a closing track to be. I guess neo-psych would be the best description of the genre here. It's such a meditative and climactic finale, and Daniel Caesar does a fantastic job adding a holy, churchy, larger-than-life feel to it, as well as a really sweet somber piano jaunt near the end of the track that brings the whole experience to a very apt and appropriate finish. I absolutely think it would be safe to say that this is Lil Yachty's best project to date, and better yet, a beautiful new start to another path of a musician's career, one where he fuses his bombastic and outrageous personality with genuinely good production and features, and one where the weaknesses of the lyrics are actually rather charming and self-aware, as opposed to silly and try-hard. I do believe that there was still a fair bit of fat in this record that could have been cut out, particularly in a lot of the middle tracks. Songs like Pretty, Running, and Failure could have been cut far shorter, because to be kept the same length as they are, in my opinion, would have required a couple of extra ideas or so. As a wild psychedelic rock odyssey, you won't find many projects that can hold a candle to this one though, and that's why I'm giving Let's Start Here by Lil Yachty a 7 out of 10. It's closer to an 8 than a 6. Thank you very much for watching. As always, all likes, comments, and subscriptions are very much appreciated. Much love to you all. Catch you later. Bye.